Welcome to the Michael Shermer Show. I'm your host, Michael Shermer. Today's episode is also being brought to you by Oregon State University, which is inviting you to participate in their upcoming Provost Lecture Series featuring the great neuroscientist David Eagleman. It's a free virtual event next Wednesday, October 27th from 6 to 7:30 p.m. Pacific Time. So that's next Wednesday, October 27th at 6 o'clock Pacific Time. You can register for the free event at beav.es/provost-lecture. That's BEAV, they're the Beavers, Oregon State Beavers, beav.es/provost-lecture. If you forget all that, just Google Oregon State University, David Eagleman, pops right up. I just checked. I know David. I met him at TED years ago. He gave this terrific talk in which he put this jacket on, this neuro jacket thing that was going to convert our applause or any of our response into sensory touch on his torso. And it was quite the demonstration. He is one of the most interesting scientists and writers working today. He's a neuroscientist at Stanford and an internationally best-selling author. He's the founder of two venture-backed companies, Neosensory and Brain Check, and he also directs the Center for Science and Law. It's a nonprofit institute. And he's best known for his work on sensory substitution, time perception, brain plasticity, neural law, and synesthesia, in which your senses get crossed, like people that can see colors with their fingertips. And when I was a kid, I had synesthesia of, I could see the days of the week had different colors. Like Monday was red, Tuesday was brown, Wednesday was orange, and so on. I have no idea why that happened, but David explains this, and you can see some of this in the international best-selling PBS series that he hosts, The Brain with David Eagleman, and the companion book to it, The Brain, The Story of You. I've seen his series and read his books. He's terrific. In addition to his 120 academic publications, he has many popular books. His latest one is Live Wired. I want to get him on the show here soon to discuss this. It's about brain plasticity, which I'm happy to hear about because now that I'm in my mid-60s, I'm glad to know I can still learn new things and that the brain is still plastic enough to keep growing and learning, which is good. Anyway, check it out, the Oregon State University Provost Lecture Series with the great David Eagleman next Wednesday, October 27th at 6 p.m. Once again, you can register for the free event at beav.es/provost-lecture, or just Google Oregon State University, David Eagleman, and it pops right up. All right. Thanks for listening. My guest today is Charles Foster. His new book is Being a Human: Adventures in 40,000 Years of Consciousness. Charles is also the author of Being a Beast, which won the 2016 Ig Nobel Award for Biology. He tries to see what it's like to actually be an animal and writes about that. It's quite interesting. He teaches medical law and ethics at the University of Oxford, and his writing has been published in National Geographic, The Guardian, Nautilus, Slate, the Journal of Medical Ethics, and many other venues. He lives in Oxford, England. He's a professor there. He's also a veterinarian and a lawyer, or a barrister, as they say in England. He has a very interesting personal journey, which we get into, and then also what it was like for him to try to think his way back into being a Paleolithic human, and then a Neolithic human, and then an Enlightenment human. And then we hit some of the major subjects in philosophy, like what does it mean to say I? Where is the self located? And the nature of nature, that is to say, to what extent does quantum physics imply large-scale uncertainty about the world? And spooky action at a distance, the nature of what gravity actually is and what mind actually is. He says mind is mattered and matter has mind in it, sort of a panpsychism, so we bore into that, and that takes us quite a while to go through all those big issues. And then I find out toward the end, because I asked him, because certain things he said made me think he's pretty deeply religious, and he is. He's a Christian. So we probably spent half an hour there. Then why? Why Christianity? Why not Judaism or Islam or some other religion? And what are the best arguments? But even that, it's not, as you'll see, he takes, I think, more of a William James pragmatic theory of truth about these things, but not quite. He still thinks, like an Enlightenment thinker would, that you want to believe what's probably true, and he thinks Christian religion is probably the correct one. So, as you'll hear, I disagree with that, and we go back and forth on that. And I think what is a very thoughtful way. Anyway, the podcast is brought to you by the Skeptic Society. So if you want to support it through us, go to skeptic.com/donate. Anyway, enjoy the show. Thanks for listening. Thanks for your support. Charles Foster, nice to see you. Thanks for coming on the show. The new book is Being a Human, Adventures in 40,000 Years of Consciousness. That's all. You only took on 40,000 years. That's not much.
I'm sorry to disappoint.
So before we get into your book, you have one of the most interesting life trajectories. If we're going to do a human species trajectory, let's start with yours. You're a veterinarian surgeon and a barrister lawyer, and you've had other careers as well. Just give us a little brief summary of your origin story.
Where do I start? I'll start slightly later than the Upper Paleolithic. Born in Yorkshire, University of Cambridge for my first degree, University of Cambridge for my PhD. Yes, veterinarian, because I was interested in how animals were bolted together. I was labouring at that time under the delusion that you understood how something worked by taking it apart, rather than understanding how something worked by putting it together and seeing how all the parts worked. And then I became a lawyer, a trial lawyer, as Americans would understand it, drivelling away to judges on my hind legs. And the reason I did that was because I became fascinated with how the great human stories which I saw in the law reports were governed or not governed by the abstract principles of the law, which filtered down from above. And the collision between abstraction and reality is one which has continued to interest me. Anyway, I'm now, for most of my time, an academic at the University of Oxford, and I'm in the law faculty, but I'm mainly interested in questions of moral philosophy, and particularly I'm interested in questions which pertain to the subject of this book, namely, how is it possible to use personal pronouns meaningfully? I've used already in our short conversation so far, Michael, the word I. What do I mean by that? I'm interested in questions of identity and personality, and in particular, I'm interested in what we can conclude about these really important questions by what appears to happen to humans when the attributes which we use to describe ourselves get taken away by traumatic brain injury or dementia or whatever. So I want to know that I can honestly say to my children, I love you. I want to know what it means when I say to my friends, I am your friend. And it was partly a response to those sorts of questions that I went into the woods, went into the abattoirs, and wandered through the eons in the strange piece of anthropological, archaeological method acting, which is this book.
Before we get into that again, it just crossed my mind, since you work in both of these professions, one of the interests I have is the difference between science and the law. For example, just take the abortion issue. Scientists tell us, well, there's no place to draw the line perfectly, objectively, of where life begins, the conception or at the heartbeat. As you know, the Texas law was just passed that 6 weeks, the heart can be detected, therefore no abortions after that, which is catastrophic for women's rights, because most of the time they don't even know they're pregnant at 6 weeks. Or you could make it 22 weeks when the neural template is complete, where it's possible to feel pain. In other words, it depends on how you're defining it. But in the law, you just have to draw the line somewhere and say, okay, that's the law. How do you think about the difference between the law and science?
I see the two as involved in an uneasy but vital conversation, the rules for which have never been coherently defined. So I want to say that there is a lot more about human beings than can be described in the scientific language which you've just referred to. I want to say that there is there's room for ancient and vertiginous intuition in moral reasoning. But of course, the contribution which intuition has to make is a highly contentious one, and the business of politics, I guess, is or should be mostly about defining what you do with human intuitions and the extent to which intuition should give way in the face of competing evidence.
Yeah. So it seems to me, though, that the law often tracks scientific findings over the centuries. Let's say in the Middle Ages, somebody kills somebody with an axe, and the axe gets punished along with the person, which, of course, we no longer do because we know axes don't have agency. Something like that, that the findings of what human cognition is like and moral responsibility and the McNaughton law that says, if you have so much brain damage of any kind and you don't know the difference between right and wrong, okay, we're going to treat you differently than the guy that killed somebody who did know the difference between right and wrong. And we kind of understand that because of mental illness research and schizophrenia or delusions that people have. And we go, okay, or drug addictions or whatever. We say, okay, those people are not as morally culpable as the people that don't have the drug addiction or whatever. So it seems like the law often does kind of track how we understand scientifically human nature.
Yes, and so it should. So the business of what constitutes human thriving is partly an objective question, which can be properly informed by scientific discovery. We now know a lot better than we did what makes us thrive and what makes us fail to thrive. But you and I might disagree, I'm foreseeing, about exactly what has agency and what hasn't. So we might get on when we're talking about the Enlightenment part of this book to how coherent it is to say that we can talk meaningfully about mere matter, about mere non-ensouled matter. But let's park that for the moment.
Okay, yeah. All right, so when you say, I love my children, or you say to your children, I love you, do you think there's an I in there? As you know, some cognitive psychologists say the self is an illusion. It's just a whole series of neural networks solving problems. There's no, it's not in the pineal gland where the soul or the I or the self is located. It's just a distributed network, and it's an illusion to think of all of this in one skull as me. And yet, subjectively, I mean, it's a useful fiction. I sure feel like I'm a person. I'm me. And even though my personality changes through the decades, maybe, but there's kind of a core set of, just take the big five personality. I'm kind of medium between introversion and extroversion, and that hasn't changed much. That's kind of who I am. And so I think of that as kind of a fuzzy set. That's the self. How do you think about the self?
I think about the self in rather traditional Judeo-Christian terms. So it seems to me that the most coherent, the most parsimonious account is of something akin to a soul, although, Michael, you will hate that sort of word, which is enfolded in the matter which at the moment constitutes my body, is conditioned by the manner in which that matter enfolds it, conditions the matter itself by the fact that it is enfolded by it, but which is independent, to some degree at least, of the attributes of that matter. So the matter which composes my body can lose lots of the things about it which I would normally use to describe it without the me vanishing or being materially diminished or changed. So again, this is anticipating a conversation which we may have later, but it seems to me that the things that we see in the visible world are what happens when matter collides with and enters into some temporary, possibly, or long-term coalition with mind. And when I use words like I and me, I'm talking about that part of mind which is enveloped amoeba-like by the matter which constitutes me for the moment.
Well, so then let's take an Alzheimer's patient or somebody with dementia. I'll ask the question that I asked my friend Deepak Chopra. Where does Aunt Millie's mind go when her neurons die of Alzheimer's? And Alzheimer's family members often say, well, she's no longer herself. She's gone. That person that we knew is gone. And we can look inside the brain and the neurons are dead. They're shriveled up, and the plaques and tangles have destroyed the neurons. And so if ensoulment or mind exists separate from the neurons, where does it go when the neurons are dead?
Well, I don't know what answer Deepak Chopra gave you, but my answer would be something like it retreats to the universal mind from which it came. So in exploring these questions, I think it's really useful to return to the old Aristotelian distinction between substance and attributes, which was, of course, a distinction which was disinterred in the Middle Ages for the purpose primarily of defending the doctrine of transubstantiation. So the bread and the wine could remain chemically bread and wine while still being truly in substance the body and blood of Jesus. And although, again, that sort of language will be anathema, I expect to you, Michael, and certainly to almost everyone who's listened to this podcast, that sort of distinction has real utility when we're exploring these sorts of questions. So the Alzheimer's patient will lose lots of her attributes. So most of the adjectives which were used to describe her and would have been used by her to describe herself cease to apply. But nonetheless, that which really constituted her substance, still continues to exist in some form. It may be, as I've suggested, that it's gone back to that great sea of universal mind. It may be that it has just recast itself in her body in some way. It may be that it's just the brain injury or the dementia or whatever it is has caused a renegotiation of the relationship between mind and body, which means that the footprints of mind, the footprints of personality, aren't as visible to the people who are used to looking for them in the old terms. It may be that something like that is going on.
Oh, very
But
interesting.
these are great mysteries.
Yes, indeed they are. For what it's worth, Deepak's answer was almost exactly yours. Her Aunt Millie returned to where she was before she was born, in the physical body, and that, in his view, which might loosely be called kind of a Western Buddhist view, he calls himself a mind monist. That is to say, he's not a dualist. That mind is everything. Consciousness is the ground of all being. He uses kind of echoing Tillich. There's nothing to get under mind. You can't reductionistically drill down and find there's mind right there. There's no there. It's just everywhere. And that, we all return to where we were before we were born. So if you ask, well, where do you go after you die? And somebody sarcastic like myself says, well, I'm where I was before I was born, nowhere. But someone like Deepak and maybe yourself would say, actually, no, you do return to where you were before you were born. You existed in some other state.
Yeah. I think if pressed, I would want to assert more strenuously than Deepak would the idea that we're not just a homunculus crouched in some sort of Cartesian material shell, but that there is some conversation between matter and mind which affects both of those things. That they are, as a result of the intimacy of that conversation, interrelated to one another, and the sorts of dramatic transitions which happen in traumatic brain injury and in death must affect in some way the way in which we should continue to talk about personality. But something like the approximation I've just given about what happens to her section of the mind, I think must be right. But I would want to hold on to the possibility of more of a place for her discrete identity after her de-incarnation than perhaps Deepak would. So I don't think that
that's a great word.
I don't think that that personality is simply resorbed into the universal sea of consciousness in such a way as to make the previous shape that it took in our bodies irrelevant. So the shorthand and very misleading way of putting that is that the personality which has been acquired as a result of the mind being squeezed within, constrained within matter, persists even after the relocation of that portion of mind from the body which it has in life.
Yeah, interesting. So in your book, you're kind of casting yourself back in time to try to imagine what it would be like to think like somebody in the Paleolithic or Neolithic. Let's just go back a little bit and think about transubstantiation. Does the wafer and the wine turn into the body and blood of Christ? Now, today in a post-Enlightenment or Enlightenment worldview, we might say, okay, it's a metaphor. Christians believe this, but they don't really believe it literally. They just kind of take it metaphorically. It's a metaphorical truth. But what you're talking about back when this was a debate amongst theologians, they weren't thinking of it like, no, we don't mean it metaphorically. We mean literally, it becomes the body and blood of Christ. And maybe this is a way of solving the identity problem of the Trinity. As you know, another great debate, Unitarians and Trinitarians. How could God and Jesus and the Holy Ghost or Spirit be the same? I mean, Jesus can't be both the Son of God and God. That's just, doesn't that violate Aristotle's principle A is A, principle of identity? You can't be both. So how do you think they thought about that during that time of a debate, and how would you think about it in an Enlightenment sort of scientific worldview?
I think that they thought about it in more or less the same way as truly Enlightenment people now think about it, namely by acknowledging that there are very different realms of reality apart from the ones which we usually recognize. So it is recognized that human neural networks can process 11 dimensions. We normally exist in just 4 of them, so 3 spatial ones and time. But we know that as a mathematical fact, that is not the full story. And we know that we are wired up, apparently, for the reception of much more reality, and perhaps very different sorts of realities from the ones which we see in our quotidian lives. That may be so even without invoking mathematical abstractions like multiple dimensions. So we know that almost all of what constitutes us, it wells up from far below the conscious brain. The conscious bit of us, which we're using now, is really the most boring and inconsequential part of us, and doesn't have all that much effect on what we are and what we do and what we think. Most of what we say are our reasons are actually ex post facto rationalizations of our intuitions, all of which is a long-winded way of saying that this is a very mysterious universe, which has many, many, many layers, only a tiny number of which we have explored. And it seems plausible, at the very least, if not highly likely, that something like a wafer or a glass of wine exists in lots of different dimensions at once. It's therefore not ludicrous to say whether you're a medieval scholastic trying to defend transubstantiation, or you are someone working at the Hadron Collider talking about multiple dimensions, to say this thing can be what we see it is, and lots of other things as well. And I think that this was one of the great discoveries, in fact, of the Upper Paleolithic. So in the book, I describe the Upper Paleolithic as the prismatic age, by which I mean that just as a prism, when white light is shone through it, shows white light to be composed of lots and lots of different colours. So the exercise of our conscience, properly used, shows the universe to be not what it seems at first sight, to be replete with lots of exhilarating possibilities. Now, I think that was the Upper Paleolithic insight, and I think it was also the Enlightenment insight. The whole culture of skepticism is one which admits of exactly these exuberant, wild possibilities which I've been talking about. What is an anti-Enlightenment position is the sort of fundamentalist sclerosing of Enlightenment principles, which lead people like Steven Pinker to say that one of the great achievements of the scientific revolution was to make ridiculous the intuition that the universe is saturated by purpose, something which cannot be demonstrated in the empirical way which he claims, which is at its root a religious conclusion. So that is to say, this is a strange place, a strange multi-laminated place, and the very first ignition of human consciousness revealed the multi-laminated nature, revealed the mystery of it all, and the very frontiers of science showing exactly the same sorts of things about the way that the universe is.
Multi-laminated, that's such a great word. Yeah, so let's peel back some of those laminated sheets. I'm a materialist monist, contra to what Deepak calls a mind monist. So, but I'm not hardcore about it, and I'll tell you why. Because to make your point, if we just think about how the ancients thought of gravity as a force, and even all the way through Newton and up to Einstein, it's a force, almost like the metal shavings, iron shavings are attracted to the magnet. The magnet is pulling them toward it. And then Einstein said, no, that's not what's going on. It's not a force at all. It's distorting space-time, and things fall according to the distorted space-time around them. So the metaphor always uses the big rubber sheet, and you throw the heavy bowling ball down and it sags. Then you roll little marbles around it, and the marbles are falling around the distorted rubber sheet. And that's not a perfect analogy, because that sheet would be in all planes around this heavy object. So, but it works as a metaphor. And then so Einstein, okay, so it's not a force. All right. Well, so we were wrong about that for a couple thousand years. So that's why I always think, well, we don't have a good explanation for consciousness yet. And people like Pinker and others are saying, well, we'll get there. It's just boring down more into the neurons, or understanding how neural networks interact. And it'll probably be an emergent property of information processing, or global space network, or whatever the latest version of this is. And maybe not. Maybe it's in a century from now, and Einstein will come along, the neuroscience equivalent of Einstein, and go, no, it's not that at all. We've got it completely wrong. Close your eyes. Imagine this thought experiment, the two lightning bolts hitting, you're on the train moving, whatever the equivalent of that would be. And you go, oh, obviously. So it's possible that, that could happen with consciousness. And I guess that's your exercise in this book and also your previous book. What you're kind of addressing Thomas Nagel's famous experiment of what's it like to be a bat, what's it like to be, well, what are some of the other animals you were looking at there? A badger, an otter, a deer, a fox, a bird, and then in your new book, a human. In a way, the only way I can know what it's like to be a bat is if I bolted on some sonar, echolocation equipment and the proper neural networks to run it, and so on. And I got to have wings and all the apparatus to run the wings, and pretty soon I would just be a bat, and I wouldn't even be asking what's it like to be a human or something like that. And to me it's a knotty problem. So just kind of reflect back on the previous book, and then this is kind of a sequel. How do you know that you're getting closer to what it's like to be a badger or a deer or a Paleolithic human?
I don't. I mean, the previous book was a book about how accessible otherness in general was, whether it was possible to know anything at all about anything other than the very boring, very lonely contents of Charles Foster's head. Whether it was possible to have relationship with anything other than my own thoughts, whether it was possible to be anything other than self-referential and therefore self-reverential. And I thought in being a beast, oh look, if I could understand anything at all about sensory world of something is different from me as a badger, then perhaps I can understand something about the sensory worlds of my best and closest friends. And I might be able to convince myself that my conversations with my best and closest friends are not all at cross purposes. That's what that was about. But returning, Michael, to our original conversation in this context, we're talking really about whether any conclusions about the world are sufficiently certain for us simply to be able to say, yes, I'm sure. And of course, this was the great debate between Einstein and Bohr, wasn't it? So Newton had said, in principle, everything in the world is explicable and predictable. Einstein and Bohr took it up. Could any theory, in principle, correspond perfectly to the world? Einstein said yes, despite having propounded the theory of relativity. Bohr said no. You can't speak of the behavior of particles independently of the observer. Everything depends on relationship. And Bohr was right. Einstein was wrong. Hence, weird stuff like quantum non-locality. So an epistemology, Einstein's, Newton's epistemology, which says we can be certain about anything in the world, is certainly wrong. Going specifically to the question of consciousness, look, there is plainly some relationship between matter and mind. If an articulated lorry runs over my brain, something happens, as we've discussed, to the mind, which is in some way related to it. But I think it's time to start calling out the most shrill of the material reductionist neuroscientists, because the fact of the matter is that no one has been able to suggest how consciousness could emerge from unconsciousness. There has been no progress whatsoever made in that direction. Yes, people have multiplied metaphors which they think might ultimately be able to articulate the relationship. But that's hardly empirical progress, which has caused many top-ranking philosophers to go back to the simple, very ancient presumption that matter is conscious. So people like Whitehead, Strawson, Nagel, you've already mentioned. This is the simplest hypothesis. And it's one, of course, which chimes beautifully with quantum non-locality. If everything was together in one point, intimately related, every other particle at the moment immediately before the Big Bang, it would seem to follow from quantum non-locality that everything in the universe, however far away it is from point X, has a continuing controlling relationship with point or thing X, which looks very like a quantum mechanical iteration of lots of the ways in which the Eastern religions express notions of interconnectedness. Looks very like the motivation behind the Greek Orthodox expression of the immanence of God in all creation. The Greek Orthodox start the morning by saying, Holy Spirit, giver of life, present in all places and filling all things, including electrons, including badgers, including stars, including mushrooms. This is the old notion of immanence, which has been forgotten, it would seem to me, in Western Christianity's insistence for probably more political than theological reasons on transcendence.
Yeah, I had Philip Goff on the show last year. He has a new book out, not new now, but on panpsychism, making the case from panpsychism. I mean, purely from a physics and philosophy. It's not some woo-woo New Age book at all, and
No.
and yet, of course, he doesn't have a general consensus like we have climate consensus. I'm not sure how you get that with something like panpsychism. But let's just think about that for a second. I'll just ask you what I asked him. In what way is this glass of water conscious? Or the pen or the atom or molecule or whatever? How do you think about consciousness when you say something like that?
I don't have a way of thinking about it. The consciousness of a water molecule is something which is going to be so different in kind from my consciousness, simply because of the scale on which a water molecule exists, that I can't begin to wrap my head about it. And I presume it follows from that that some of the consciousness which Charles Foster possesses is a consequence of the number of conscious atoms which are conglomerated in him. And if one accepts that, one is beginning to accept something which I think is probably more palatable to you, which is that consciousness, in some degree, is an emergent property not of matter, but of the conglomeration of bits of matter together. So I think I'm more conscious than a water molecule. I'm certain that the consciousness that I have is different in expression and manifestation from that of a water molecule. Yeah, so I don't think I can give any answer except that.
Well, maybe
it must be. It must. Yeah.
Let's go back to your other profession as a veterinarian. I mean, so you work with animals, and your previous book, you tried to become animals to see what that was like. Surely they are sentient beings. They have some level of consciousness. But we think of it kind of a scale up. The more layers of neural networks you have, the more sentient you are. In other words, there's no time at which the lights come on. Look in human history, go back, 200,000 years, 2 million years, whatever. There's no point where the light switches. It's a rheostat. It just kind of comes, it's dim, and then it's slightly less dim, and then it's a little bit brighter, and whatever adjectives we want to use. And then all of a sudden now we're sentient. But it's not all of a sudden. And so I think like, Dan Dennett makes this argument for free will, degrees of freedom. Just how many options do you have? We have more than chimps, maybe chimps more than the dog more than the cockroach or whatever, all the way down to a single bacterium has like 2 degrees of freedom, or maybe 4, whatever, up, down, left, right, and so on, to move along the chemical gradients as it tries to capture energy in its environment. I wonder if we could think of consciousness along those lines, of degrees of freedom or degrees of something.
Well, degrees of freedom are presumably some sort of metric of consciousness. I think I've got more freedom than a water molecule. And one of the reasons for that is that the consciousness which I have is more sophisticated, and there's more of it, and it's more multivalent. And I suspect that I have more consciousness and therefore more degrees of freedom than a mouse, although I don't know. It may be the other way around, though. I'm thinking of Huxley, who talks about, as you know, human brains as reducing valves, which slow down the flow of information into our brains to the manageable dribble, which we call the data upon we rely on to reconstruct the worlds of which we are conscious. It may be that the less sophisticated your brain, the less reduction there is of the data that flows in. So it may be that a mouse is far more epistemologically enlightened than we are, that it appreciates far more of the way the world really is than I do. And that relates to some of the things that I talk about in this book, to the effect that language, which we think in and which rules us, may constrict tyrannously our understanding of the world, might constrict the number of categories in which we can place the things in the world outside. So I am a very linguistic person. My son Tom is dyslexic. He has the glorious gift of dyslexia. If I go into a wood and look at a tree, I get some visual images from that tree on my retina. Those visual images are translated almost immediately into things which have nothing whatever to do with that actual tree. Remembered fragments of poems about trees, remembered physiological facts about trees. I have never seen a real tree. Now, my son Tom has, because he doesn't undertake that process of reduction, of chopping up. So Tom sees trees all the time, and he sees trees as defined by the context in which they exist, and he sees, I expect, insofar as being able to tell me, the charisma of trees in a way which is completely invisible to me. Again, to return to our previous conversation, it may be that since animals, so far as we know, don't have that sort of linguistic spin on the world, they see trees far more accurately than I do.
Certainly, my dog thinks about the environment differently than I do. I hike with him every day for about 2 miles and up in the mountains here, and often I think, boy, that would be so boring to be him. But I don't think he's bored at all. I mean, I'm putting my brain in his body, thinking, oh, I'd be bored if I was just smelling things and peeing on things and running around. But he doesn't seem bored at all, and so it's really hard to know what it would be like. I'm thinking here I thought of Temple Grandin when you were just speaking. She's on autism spectrum. She's a PhD in animal behavior and so on, and she can tell us what it's like to be a cow in a factory farm that you and I just can't imagine. And then here's how it should be designed and so on for just for the betterment of the animals and everybody. But so that's what you're talking about. It's like so when did humans become fully human in that sense? Yeah, go ahead anyway. Go ahead, respond to that.
Well, no, I was just going to respond to your dog story by asking you a question. I mean, don't you envy your dog? Don't you think that your dog is relating far more satisfactorily to the world than you are? If your dog is capable of delighting in your walk in a way that you're not, um, isn't your dog exhibiting a rather more advanced type of consciousness on some definition?
Not only that, he doesn't
Um,
have to worry about mortgage payments and insurance and and all the other stuff that comes
right.
with the modern world. Yes, sometimes I do envy him.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, life is simple. He has his ball and his bone and he just likes to run around and yeah, and sleep and eat. It's pretty good.
Well,
Uh,
my point is slightly my point is almost exactly the opposite. His life is not simple. His life is uh, complex in a way which we are incapable of appreciating. So he sees a lot. He sees what you would see of the ball which is bouncing in front of his nose. Um, he sees what you would see if you could um, see the ball in 5 or 6 dimensions instead of the four which we're normally tied into. Maybe his reducing valve lets him uh, see what a Gauguin would see when he uh, runs through a meadow of grass. I don't know.
Yeah, no. That's a tough one. I had Donald Hoffman on the podcast too. He has his interface theory of cognition, or interface theory of perception (ITP), in which it's an interface. So his analogy is like all the icons on your laptop, like the trash. You drag it; it looks like a trash can. But if you open my little MacBook Pro, there's no trash can in there. It's just kind of an icon that represents just a bunch of electrons moving around, and it's something like that. So his argument is that we did not evolve veridical perception. The point of life is not to
Mm.
get an accurate reading of reality, it's to survive and reproduce and pass on our genes and whatever it takes for that. So literally my dog is literally seeing the world differently than me. I just have no idea what his icons are like. I couldn't possibly know other than just kind of projecting ourselves, which you try to do, like going into being an animal or a Paleolithic ancestor and imagine what life is like that way. Hard to do. So when,
Yeah. So sorry.
well, I was just going to say. So
Far away.
let's go back 40,000 years. They have
Right.
language, symbolic language. They have love and relationships and families and small bands of people that are weary about other bands that could be dangerous. And the world's a dangerous place with predators and so on. We don't experience much of that kind of risk. But we do have relationships and love and jealousy and things like that. But even there, when evolutionary psychologists, for example, will talk about love or jealousy or pair bonding, monogamy, and then critics will push back and go, no, 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 that's an artifact of the modern world. Marriage and jealousy. People are jealous just because of the idea of private property or whatever, and maybe our ancestors didn't have those same feelings. Although I think pretty good arguments for that they probably did. But how do you think about like modern emotions and relationships compared to say Paleolithic
Hmm.
peoples?
Well, I mean, I think the place to start is by saying something about what is meant by behavioral modernism. So I started
Mm.
this journey 40,000 years or so ago, because that, more or less, give or take 10,000 years, I'll say, is when we first see in the archaeological record people who, so far as we can work out, uh, behave in the way that we do, construct the world in the same way that we do, have the same presumptions about the sorts of animals that they are as we do. And the main thing in the archaeological record, which evidences that, is the explosion of symbolism, which you see. So you suddenly see um, stone and bone beginning to be shaped to stand for things other than stone and bone, while still remaining stone and bone. So a piece of bone might be carved into a wolf and might become a wolf while still remaining a piece of bone. Now, once you have that thought in your mind, the possibilities which the world contains proliferate massively. Nothing is impossible. The greatest of the symbolic steps was, of course, language. And I've just described, by describing my own linguistic pathology, which most people will probably regard as not pathology at all, just describe that linguistic pathology as the end result of this symbolic revolution. So words, for me, not only stand for the things which they purport to represent, but have completely overwhelmed them, become hugely more important to me than the tree, for instance, is described by the word tree. Language confers huge numbers of selective advantages. For instance, it allows you to formulate thought experiments, which means that you can plan out in the safety and comfort of your head the possible ways in which you're going to approach the herd of mammoths, rather than trying it out in the real mammoth occupied world where you might only get one chance to do it. But I think that certainly in the early part of that linguistic revolution, words were used as tools rather than becoming controllers of the way that we did stuff. They didn't construct the Upper Paleolithic world. They were rather like pieces of flint in order to divide things in a way which was useful. There's no reason at all to suppose that that emotions weren't just the ones that we have now. There's relatively little evidence, contrary to what Steven Pinker says, that Upper Paleolithic people were very violent, but that may be because they had no need to be. There was much more room to go around. There weren't the communities which were ruled by supply and demand, which a very toxic chemical indeed for the generation of human violence. That all came much later in the Neolithic. But as soon as you see behaviorally modern humans, you see, by definition, us with all our flaws, all our glory.
Yeah. Okay, a couple things on that. I'll push back on the Pinker thing for just a moment, But first, I don't know if you know the work of Louis Leidenberg, who is a historian of science and a tracker, an animal tracker. So he actually thinks we evolved, basically conjecture and refutation, hypothesis testing. This is what trackers do. They have a little bit of data that comes in. Oh, there's a footprint here, or there's the body print where the animal was asleep underneath the bush, and now he's gone and the footprints went that way. Now the sun is over here, and it's starting to get hot, and by noon it's going to be blazing hot, so he's probably heading to that set of bushes over there where there's shade and water, so let's go there. And then they go, and then they test the hypothesis and so on. That's kind of a rationality, a form of reasoning in a scientific, empirical way.
Yeah.
That the implication is that our Paleolithic ancestors had all the rational apparatus we have today. They were just as smart as us in that sense.
Sure. Well, our brains have shrunk, in fact, it would seem.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, a little bit.
So I don't doubt their rationality. I don't doubt their ability to reason. But what I think they had was a far greater intuitive sense than we have, a far greater clairvoyant connection with both the human and the non-human world. The sort of clairvoyant connection which you see between modern hunter-gatherers and their prey. grants Fanta writes about some of these.
You mean,
And
but do you mean literally paranormal clairvoyant, or just metaphorically that they're more in tune with their environment and they're better at processing the information that you and I would miss if we were walking down a trail in the woods?
I mean what you describe as paranormal, and I describe as entirely natural.
Hmm.
It seems to me that if we have electrons in my brain which affect the electrons in star Sirius, 52 billion miles away, it's not all that implausible to postulate that a San Bushman who is tracking a kudu might be able to broadcast over 50 kilometers or so back to camp the fact that he has killed the kudu and will arrive back in 8 hours. That seems to me to be a very little ask for brains, which we seem to have.
Right. Yeah, you talk
composed
about
of the sorts of materials that we perceive them to be composed of.
yeah, interesting. Yeah, as you know, I'm skeptical of that. Rupert, you talk about Rupert Sheldrake in your book a little bit. When owners know that their dogs, when dogs know that their owners are coming home. Well, as you know, Richard Wiseman and a couple other scientists tried to replicate those, and they had a hard time replicating. A lot of that research has not survived the replication crisis, like Bem's experiment on extrasensory pornception, as it's jokingly called. Where the subjects could tell which side of the screen the pornographic image was going to pop on before the computer had even decided which one it would be through a random number generator. And so he implied backward causality, which would be stunning. I mean, it'd be like an Einstein kind of revolution in physics. But, again, others like Stuart Ritchie tried to replicate it and they couldn't. And there was some methodological problems. So the examples you talk about in your book, I mean, they're interesting. It could be real, could be true, but they haven't survived the replication. How do we know something's true in science? Well, you can't just have one experiment. You got to be able to run the experiment. It's separate from me and that lab over there and so on. Then we get a kind of convergence of confidence, a consensus like in climate science. Yeah, okay, this is global warming. It's probably human caused and really happening. And there's skeptics, but probably it's true. And I don't think the paranormal research has passed that criteria like climate science has.
Fair enough. Well, that's maybe a conversation for another day. But I recall in the book a story told by an American writer I very much admire called Michael Shermer, who talks about...
Here's the radio. There it is.
Who talks about a radio.
Yes.
I don't want to be sycophantic, but I admire very much the way that you, with your background and your convictions and your public profile, were able to acknowledge your bafflement and how disconcerted you were by that. And I'm asking only two things. One, that we allow ourselves in true Enlightenment spirit to the possibility of being disconcerted by something that happens in the world, rather than thinking that everything is completely predictable, everything's sewn up. I want us to be on the side of Bohr rather than Einstein. Us to be on the side of the demonstrated Heisenberg uncertainty principle, realizing that uncertainty is part of the weave of the universe. And secondly, I want to suggest, and this is something that we've talked about already, that, as Jeff Kripal would put it, we know that that mind is matter, but it seems at least plausible to suggest that matter is minded. And if that's right, for some of the reasons that we've been through already, something akin to those sorts of remote sensing experiences, which are fairly ubiquitous, are the sorts of things we'd expect to happen. your radio experience was not an outlier. It's
I realize that a lot of
all
people
square with
have. Yeah, I got a lot of letters from people saying similar experiences, not necessarily with radios, but just really unusual, anomalous experiences. A lot of letters. And then when you look into that literature, there's a whole literature of anomalous psychological experiences that people have, and it's stunning. It's amazing. So for my listeners that have no idea what we're talking about, in one of my Scientific American columns, I wrote about this little transistor radio here, which belongs to my wife. It was her grandfather's 1977 Philips 070 transistor radio. And she was raised by a single mom and her grandfather, and then he passed away, and she inherited the little radio. And then when we met and she decided to move to California to be with me, she shipped all of her stuff in the mail, including the radio. And I tried to get it working for her because I knew it was meaningful to her, but it was dead. I put new batteries in, and I did the old, slam it on the table thing to try to get it to work. And, nothing worked. So the day of our wedding, she was just here in California. She was feeling kind of lonely. It was just me, my family and friends, nobody that she knew intimately, like her family and friends. And so she was just feeling blue. And then, so we just took a moment in the back bedroom at my house, and music was coming out of the, I don't know where it was coming from. And, I didn't have a stereo system in the house. It wasn't the laptop with iTunes open. It wasn't the neighbor. And then, I figure out it's this radio that I just shoved in a drawer in the desk, this desk I'm sitting on here. And I opened the drawer, and there's the radio. And it's not on static. It's not between stations. It's on, and it's not like, some obnoxious radio talk show host screaming in the microphone. It's like beautiful romantic music playing. It's like, whoa, right. So I wrote about this, she was deeply meaningful to her. We're both atheists, okay? But, for us, it's like, okay, whatever you want to say, he was metaphorically here or he was literally here in however that would work, what difference does it make? It's a beautiful thing, and it's that kind of timing. Of course, I got letters from people saying, no, it's the solenoid had some energy in it, and what they had natural, like a piece of dust, fell off and made the connection. I got those kind of explanations. But Deepak's point, because he shared this story too, was that it's the timing of it. It doesn't matter. Of course, it has a natural explanation. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the emotional content and meaning for you and you alone, you and your wife. Okay, so so there, I just kind of left it open at the end of the column, and I've written about it elsewhere a little bit longer. And the same thing, it's like Kip Thorne's film Interstellar, where at the end of the film, during the middle of the film, there's this kind of paranormal thing where this watch, the hands are moving on a watch, and a book falls off a shelf, and all these what we would call paranormal, ESP or whatever, telekinesis. But then Kip shows how actually general relativity allows for this kind of backwards causality, and he has the story plot where the astronomer in the future near a black hole I think he goes through a wormhole and a tesseract or something like that, where he's able to reach back into time and manipulate the physical environment. Now, Kip is a good friend. He is as hardcore, world-class Nobel laureate physicist as you're ever going to find, right? No woo-woo in his worldview at all. And yet he shows this could happen. This is how it would happen. It would take, a lot. It's hard to build a wormhole, but he's just showing it doesn't violate any laws of physics. So I kind of left it at that. Let's just leave the mystery there, because we don't know. There's a lot we don't know. And so I gather that's kind of the point of your book. Anyway, so go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, a very similar thing happened to me, which I wrote in the book. So when my sister and I went into the room where my father had died, we were standing there weeping together. This is about 6 months after he died, and the radio suddenly switched on. It's not as dramatic as yours, because it wasn't a particularly comforting piece of music. But it was a strange thing. There were no batteries in it, etc., etc. The other comment to make is that Jeff Kripal observes in his look at out-of-body experiences and the like, that mind seems to speak directly to mind, he puts it, particularly when other modes of communication are impossible. Your radio might be an example of that. Perhaps the alleged remote sensing of the San Bushmen is an example of that. Perhaps out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences are examples. So it may be that we are inhibited by our very powerful reducing valves from using anything like the full capacity of our ability to broadcast and transmit with our minds. But even despite the atrophy which occurs with the very tedious way in which we choose to live our lives, that residual ability somehow, to some extent, persists, at least in some people.
I think this is the argument Rupert Sheldrake also makes, that it's not that the reductionistic worldview is incorrect, it's incomplete, right? It doesn't give the whole picture.
Right.
But isn't that the kind of the point of emergent science and chaos theory, and that you have to put it back together. You can't just take it apart, and putting it back together, it does come out differently than the parts. Okay, but that's still science.
Right. I think that it's really helpful to go back, as it's so often very helpful to go back to William James, who makes the very important point that to say that something is a function of the brain is not the same as saying that it's produced by the brain. So function can indicate transmission. So going back to prisms, a prism refracts light but doesn't produce it. The output looks different from the input. The characteristics of the prism determine the output. And so perhaps what brains are doing is giving a particular color to that part of mind, whatever that is, that beams into it. And it may be that some of the woo-woo things that we've just been mentioning are examples of that.
Yeah, let's talk about Pinker a little bit, because he's a good friend. I know his work quite well. I think when he says the universe doesn't have a purpose, well, first of all, there's the Dawkins way of thinking about that. It's it's pitiless indifference, and it's just our selfish genes and so forth. But the other part Steve's talking about there, like in Enlightenment now, is that to our ancestors, the world was imbued not just with purpose but agency. That the crops failed, and the pandemic, and the storms, and the witches, and the trees, and the rocks. It's all agency. There's just spirits and animas. Everything's animated, and that one of the things science did was to kind of dispel those myths, and that's a good thing, because we're talking about the nice things of anomalous experiences, but there's a lot of bad things, like burning women as witches because they cavort with demons in the middle of the night, which causes crop failures, is a bad idea.
Yeah.
And we should debunk those bad ideas. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. But it is simply not the case. And most of our discussion for the last hour, Michael, has been to this effect. Simply not the case that we can exclude the possibility that there is no agency in an electron. Indeed, what's emerging from the frontiers of quantum science is that something very akin to agency, in the sense of influence over billions of miles and billions of years, is precisely what happens. If you can't exclude agency, that is the ability to influence, how can you possibly exclude the possibility of a purpose which directs what the individual entities in the universe do with their capacity to be agents? So my quarrel with that comment is simply its offensively religious character. I'm entirely on board with the thesis that the Enlightenment has brought many, many, many wonderful things. But the thing which characterized the Enlightenment, namely vibrant, fearless skepticism is one which I don't see in a lot of the high priests of the modern Enlightenment. I want to be in an Enlightenment age. I think the real spirit of the Enlightenment was, to repeat, seen in those Upper Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who saw that the world was full of possibilities um, because their own consciousness was just dawning, had no preconceptions at all about the nature of the world or the limits on the combinations of possibilities that there might be. That's a proper Enlightenment spirit.
Yeah, I liked your discussion of the cave paintings, Paleolithic cave paintings. You know, the initial interpretation, well, it's kind of sympathetic magic. They're painting the animals that they want to kill, and this is going to bring good luck or something like that. Well, as you point out, those aren't the animals that they were actually eating. The bones of the animals that they were killed and ate were not the ones on the wall. All right, so then what?
Yeah,
What is going on?
You also don't see missiles. Yeah, yeah,
right. Yeah. So, what do archaeologists think is the meaning of those, or what's the purpose of cave art? It's not like a museum; anybody can go there. Some of these are really hard to access.
Mm. Yes. Well, there are, of course, many theories, but perhaps the dominant one is the David Lewis Williams thesis, which sees the paintings as emerging from a shamanic culture. So lots of these paintings, which are artistically highly accomplished, I think that you see art of a
Totally.
quality there that you don't see anywhere in human history, and I'm including the glories of the Italian Renaissance in that. So these are people who knew how to draw animals, but yet these animals are often floating. They're not on any plane, which makes sense in relation to any of the other animals there. Sometimes they're missing a hind quarter or a forequarter. It's as if the cave wall is perceived as a barrier, a veil between this world and another. So the caribou has one leg in this world and one leg in another. And often associated with these cave paintings, you see therianthropes, so animal-human hybrids, which are conventionally interpreted as representing shamans in the process of transforming to or from animals in order to go into the other world, however you want to put it, the other plane of reality, the other dimension, across the cave wall, in order to intercede with the benevolent spirits on the other side and bring back blessings, goods, information about the weather or the movements of the herds or whatever it was for their clan. So that's probably as close to orthodoxy as you can
And
get.
the oldest of these cave paintings is what, 40, 50,000 years?
Well, but probably about 40. So the interesting thing is that you get the height of Upper Paleolithic cave art right at the beginning. Lascaux and all the rest, all these fantastic things in southwestern Europe, and then it goes downhill after that. And certainly, by the time you come to the Neolithic, you have things which, from an artistic perspective, are relatively degraded. They're certainly much less naturalistic. It may be that I'm denigrating the Neolithic rather because a lot of the Neolithic paintings are encoding things which had to be explained by some sort of priestly caste. But nonetheless, the general artistic trajectory seems to be down. And it starts going down right from the start of behavioral modernism.
Which you date about when? The
Well,
Neolithic?
it depends where you are in the world. It depends where you are. So, no, the Upper Paleolithic. So, 50,000, 45,000, 40,000. It depends where you are in the world as well. So the archaeology has been skewed by a lot of Eurocentrism. So Europe has been dug far more diligently than Africa has. And the more people look in Africa, the more and the earlier and the more sophisticated the findings are. If you look at the bridge between Africa and Europe, in other words, the Middle East, you get places like Hafsa in Israel, which confound all the chronologies. You see, 150,000 years ago, things which look really behaviorally modern. So the answer in prehistoric archaeology is the answer that you always get in philosophy and in theology, if it's done honestly, which is A, we don't know, B, insofar as we do know, it depends.
Yeah, okay. So let's go fast forward then to Göbekli Tepe, which you talk about, which I didn't know much about
Yeah,
until I read Graham Hancock's book on it. And then I was on
right.
Joe Rogan's podcast for almost 4 hours talking to him about all these kinds of things. And, to his credit, he's not an ancient
Yeah,
alien guy. He doesn't think the ancient astronauts did it. He just thinks that there was an ancient civilization, maybe 30,000 years ago, something like that, advanced. Not advanced like they had electricity or metal tools. He means advanced, I think, in the way you're thinking about it, more spiritually or wisdom wise or
yeah,
something like that.
yeah,
But I have to admit, Göbekli Tepe it's a real anomaly for archaeologists because for those not familiar
yeah,
with this, it's I don't know 5,000 to 6,000 years older than any other monumental architecture, which we're told requires a big, huge population with a division of labor. So you got to have farming and all the accoutrements of having a state that, with laws and a political system and a religion and all that. And here, this was built by what looks to be hunter gatherers. So apparently they are more sophisticated than we thought they were. Because again, you have to just look this thing up. There's these like 10, 20 ton T-shaped stones with bas relief animals carved into them, not carved into them, carved out of them. I mean, the animals are a bas relief. They're sticking out from the stone. And it's quite stunning. What are those animals doing there? No one lived there, right? It was a ceremonial place or whatever. To me, this is another one of these arguments that we better be careful about grand theorizing about our ancestors when the next turn of the spade is going to show something like Göbekli Tepe.
yeah. Yes, it's a fascinating monument in eastern Turkey. Um, I think its real significance is perhaps political rather than anything else. So it indicates that highly sophisticated people continued to want to live as hunter-gatherers when they didn't have to. That's not the narrative that we tell ourselves. We tell
Interesting.
ourselves that the way we are, being sedentary people with a regular income from crops and regular food from crops and animals, um, that's the way to go, and that is desirable, and that all right-thinking people would regard it as desirable. Göbekli Tepe says no. And the work of James C. Scott, American anthropologist, brilliant book, Against the Grain, makes this point superbly. So he demonstrates that even when a move from hunter-gatherer life to sedentary life of the sort that we think is the only way to thrive, was perfectly feasible, people are very reluctant to do it. Normally, they only abandon hunter-gatherer lifestyles if people force them to do it. One example, a very recent one, is the Black Death in England, which took out a lot of the rural population. That meant that there was lots of land available in England. People stopped, as a result, doing plough agriculture. They went back to the old slash and burn agriculture, a turn significantly back into history towards the old hunter-gatherer life. Modern hunter-gatherers in Southern Africa interviewed about why they had abandoned their previous hunter-gatherer lives in order to take up pastoralism, said, oh, it's because the economy changed. We had to have cows in order to pay the bride price because cattle were the only currency used. So people only take up the lifestyle which we think is the only decent one if they're forced to do so. And you can see some of the reasons why there should be reluctance if you look at what skeletons look like in those early Neolithic settlements. You know, their teeth are rotting in a way that hunter-gatherers' teeth never rotted. They've got arthritic conditions as a result of squatting all day, grinding corn. Everything seems to suggest that this is when status developed in a really toxic way. Societies grew too large for policing through shame and had to have metaphorically uniformed people in order to maintain the laws. Men and women became divided because the men who were out in the fields could come home and say, "Oh, we're the people who bring in the crop that you need in order to eat." So this is an old thesis, and now I think an uncontroversial one. But lots of our modern ills can be traced to the decision to sit still in one place, which might have happened because simply too lazy to carry on wandering after the herds, or too lazy to carry on gathering the berries off the bushes.
Yeah, certainly, and shorter. They were shorter than our Paleolithic ancestors and died much younger. You can see all that in the bones and the teeth.
Yeah, and it's interesting that one of the consequences of domestication, not just in humans but in other animals, including weirdly fish, is that brains get smaller, and in particular, the limbic system shrinks. So that is the system which keeps you alive, alert. So we're less alive, just as a neurological fact.
This is the humans as self-domesticated hypothesis. Richard Wrangham talks about this in his latest book. That we, are in addition to becoming controlling our violence, our brains got smaller and our teeth got smaller, our jaws got smaller, and so forth.
Right.
Well, I also wanted to think about the axial age. Could you refer a few times to like ancient Greece and also the rise of religions, major world religions? Let's just think about that. Maybe this is your next book because you kind of skip from the Neolithic to the Enlightenment. It's like, wait a minute, there's that super interesting time from like the 8th century BC to the 3rd century BC, where you have these great leaders, and maybe take it all the way up to Jesus and just ask, were these, Buddha, Jesus, the Greeks, Romans, and so on, Socrates and whatnot. This seems like also a special period of time in human history when major things happened. How do you think about that in your thesis of long human history?
Well, I do apologize in the book for not including
that. Yeah.
But the reason that I didn't include it was that it seems to me to be more a manifestation of what we do with our existing consciousness rather than an illustration of a pivotal leap forward in the type of consciousness that we have. And the Upper Paleolithic and the Neolithic and the Enlightenment all seem tectonic moments. So in what you describe as the axial age, we've got this suite of facilities. We've been given by our enormous brains a set of tools which allow us, for the first time, to formulate with particularity questions like, "What am I? What am I here for?" And the history of that age is really about the conversations that resulted, rather than being about major mutations in the sorts of brains that were having the conversation.
Well, maybe that's your next book. That'll be the third in your trilogy. All right, Charles. Let me just kind of ask just a couple of broader questions. I'm sure you must get this one. You're an Oxford professor. You probably have a pretty good life there. I've been to Oxford. It's a wonderful place to live. But everything you've said, why not take the family and haul off and start a new life in Amazonian or in Africa somewhere as hunter gatherers?
Well, the honest answer is that my wife, of whom I'm really quite fond, will probably leave me.
Yes, I would imagine so.
The serious point is that we can't, as a society, turn the clock back. We can't be hunter-gatherers, even if we would thrive better as individuals were we to be hunter-gatherers. There are simply too many of us, and there aren't enough places where we could hunt or gather. But I think that there are ways in which we can try better to express in our lives our knowledge of the lessons which we've learned from immersing ourselves in hunter-gatherer culture. And I do try to get out. I love that line from David Abraham. There are only relatively unwild places. So this desk in Oxford, which I'm sitting at, is, if I could only see it properly, a wild place. It's covered with an uncontrolled and uncontrollable efflorescence of bacteria and fungi, as is my own body. So if I only perceive these suburban places properly, I will know that I'm a wild creature in a wild place. And I try to remind myself consciously of that all the time. And I also try to bring to my appreciation of everything in my ordinary life the sorts of the sort of attention which I think was Upper Paleolithic attention. So an attention which was both focused and holistic, with the balance between those two hemispheres, which we've so catastrophically lost. And I also try to define myself, and I think this is an Upper Paleolithic insight too, in terms of the nexus of relationships of which I'm a part, which include relationships with the non-human world. So if you ask me, where is Charles Foster at the moment, the better answer is not Oxford, but I can only answer it by reference to triangulation from all the other creatures in my vicinity who are important to me, and more widely by reference to all the other entities in the universe, because I'm conditioned by them, which is both a vertiginous thought and thrilling and liberating one.
Yeah, we can't go back, obviously, given the world's population. Even if you reduced it by 90%, it would still be too big for hunter-gathering to support. But, you know, part of the modern environmental movement is to just make spaces greener and more natural, more organic, and get out of the house, go hiking, go walking in the woods, go barefoot, and try to vary your diet. And we know that, most of the modern ills like diabetes and obesity are a result of these crappy diets that no hunter-gatherer in the right mind would eat. Just something getting back to that kind of lifestyle is probably a good way to go. Let me just ask you, just kind of wrap up. Just because you mentioned some religious themes early in the conversation, I couldn't get from your books what your religiosity is or what you believe about that. And as you know, our friend Richard Dawkins and others, the new atheists, are very worried about the kind of fundamentalism that leads to things like terrorism and whatnot. And nationalism, I would add on to that, is just as deadly. But where do you stand religiously, given that mind and matter interact? Do you believe that there's a God of some kind, and how would it
Yeah,
interact with us?
yeah. So I've talked about universal mind, and I've talked about the way in which I think that that mind interacts with the matter which there is in the universe, whatever matter, in order to create the visible universe. But it does seem to me that um, the, the explanation which makes most sense is the Judeo-Christian monotheistic. So I'm very sorry, Michael, if I have, being a believer, um, been invited under false pretenses onto your podcast.
You don't
But yes,
apologize. Why would I?
that's
I love having you on. What do you mean? I don't want to just talk to atheists, for
no,
God's sakes. How boring is that?
yeah. So I think that God is the best hypothesis, and and the sort of melding of universal mind with matter that we see in the incarnation seems to me to be a good expression of general principles of the insubstantiation of mind, which
You mean you're talking
I've
about
spent the last
Jesus,
now hour and a half.
the incar
Yeah,
in yeah, okay. So, well, that's interesting. If I said, how does God reach into the world to stir the particles, say to make miracles happen or cure somebody's cancer or whatever prayed for, um, would you respond something like, it's the same Cartesian problem of body and mind? How does my thinking cause my muscles to move to raise my arm? We don't really have a good explanation for that. How just the pure thought interacts with the tissue, the the neurons, and so on. Something like that.
I I think I'd answer simply by repeating that Greek Orthodox morning prayer, which expresses the relationship between divine mind and matter. Exactly what the operation of that mind, in particular lumps of matter, whether those lumps are tumors or uh, uh, atrophying nerves, is something I can't begin to make coherent
Yeah,
postulates about.
yeah, yes. But so you accept Jesus as actually was the Son of God and is the Savior and died for our sins and then was resurrected.
Well, that seems to me to be a, a rational and the most rational way of looking at the evidence from lots of quarters, both from the Hadron Collider and from first century Palestine.
The Hadron Collider. So you're talking about subatomic uh, particle effects.
I am.
Yeah, one objection I have to that I didn't bring up earlier. It's not super important for the conversation, but that those kinds of effects, the two slit experiment, and how an event that happens here can instantly affect another particle in some other star, 50 billion. I think it was more like trillion light years away, or it could be in another galaxy. And how is that possible? Well, okay, so this is a grand mystery, but does it really apply to macro events? That is to say, we're not subatomic particles. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting objection, and it always slightly amuses me that it's an objection which is articulated almost entirely by material reductionists, whose ruling axiom is that the tiny necessarily rules the macro. So if there is nothing but the tiny particles that make up the natural world, it must follow from that that what happens at a bigger level is a manifestation of the of the matter, and on that hypothesis is nothing but matter, which is made up of those tiny particles. So it would seem to me that arguments along those lines would get the thoroughgoing materialist into a terrible bind, and I can't myself see at the moment how one could plausibly seek to escape from that bind. You could only escape from it if you start saying that when you start aggregating particles, something different in nature starts to happen. Something different in nature, that is, from the basic particle. And once you start saying something like that, you're coming quite close to invoking something along the nature of the consciousness inherent in matter, which you're so reluctant to admit. Consciousness inherent in an aggregation of particles is no less significant a problem for a material reductionist than consciousness inherent in tiny subatomic particles. So, what I'm saying is that's your problem, not mine.
Okay. Well, yeah. Let me ask you what a question I ask a lot of Christians, which is to say, if you think if you want to make the argument this is literally true, that is, there really was a Jesus, he really did rise from the dead, and so forth, and that the evidence for it is substantial enough, it's the best inference to the best explanation for all these other things as well. Why don't Jews believe this? I mean, they believe in the same God you believe in. They believe even the same book, at least the Old Testament book. They don't call it the Old Testament though. And you can't say, well, these, if they just understood the arguments from C.S. Lewis or whoever you want to use, or here's the 10 best arguments for the resurrection and so on. If they understood that, they would then draw the same proper conclusion that this is likely to be the best religion or the correct one. But they do know those arguments, and they don't accept it. They even think that there is a Messiah. They just don't think the carpenter from Nazareth was the Messiah because he didn't fulfill the correct prophecies from the book of Daniel, I guess it was. What do you say to that argument?
Well, I say that A, it's not a question for me, but B, very little of what we believe is led by reason. If someone's born and brought up in Saudi Arabia, they become a Muslim. These things are not conditioned by propositions. Propositions have a very little ability to affect anything meaningful about our lives. Paul wasn't converted by the catechism. He was
right.
converted by an encounter. He was converted by a relationship. He was converted by an experience, which is going back to our discussion about the importance of the unconscious and the subconscious, where our real selves really exist, where all the real decisions are made, where the real I, if there is an I, must reside.
Interesting. So you're arguing that it's a religious truth is different than, say, an empirical truth. Whether or not global warming is real and human caused, we can resolve that, and it either does or it's either true or it's not. But the resurrection is not that kind of claim.
I'm not saying that at all. If the resurrection didn't happen, then Christianity is a lie.
Well, not a lie. It's just in error. That part.
All right. If the resurrection didn't happen as a historical fact, then Christianity has been preaching things which it shouldn't have been preaching for the last 2,000 years. That the psychological and sociological and political reasons why people don't accept those facts have nothing to do with its empirical truth or otherwise.
Right, but so okay.
I expect that if I'd been brought up in Alabama, I would not be as convinced as I am of the necessity to bring quantum non-locality into
probably not
the argument about the truth or otherwise of the Christian claim.
Yes,
but that's a psychological fact of no great interest. The empirical question of whether Jesus rose from the dead is something of enormous interest. If it did happen, then the universe is a very different place from the one that you think it is. It's rather similar, I think, to the sort of place that I perceive it to be, as corroborated by evidence from some of the other domains which we've wandered through tonight.
Yeah, I'll retell a story I've told on this podcast several times of a conference I was at with Richard Dawkins and Ken Miller. Ken Miller is the a biologist who debunked the intelligent design arguments about irreducible complexity in cellular structures and things like that. But he's a Catholic anyway. So, I mean, he's a hardcore evolutionary biologist and Darwinian and so on, but still a Catholic. And he wrote that great book on, I forget the title of it now. Any case, Finding Darwin's God, maybe it was. Anyway, sorry, listeners. But Ken Miller is the author of the book. And
I think it's Darwin's God, isn't it?
Yeah. Darwin's God, yes. So, every chapter is Richard Dawkins could have written all the chapters and you wouldn't notice the difference. But the last chapter, he says, well, by the way, I'm a Catholic. And so anyway, so we were at this conference together and Richard starts pressing him. Okay, if we found a piece of the true cross, which people claim exists, but we know this is the right one, and there's a little piece of flesh on there, and we could extract the DNA like we can do now, and sequence its genome. Would it be different from human because born of a virgin and so forth, and he has divinity to him, and Ken just kind of stopped him and said, Richard, I'm not claiming this is true in an empirical biological DNA sense. I just mean I'm a Catholic. This is what we believe. And full stop. I'm not claiming it's empirically. I'm not claiming I can prove it. It's just what I accept as true in a different domain. I gather you would disagree with that kind of line of reasoning.
Well, I think that sort of reasoning has lots of utility in lots of areas pertinent to this discussion. But I think there are some genuine, some theoretically, empirically demonstrable things about Christianity which are indispensable. And there are others which can, without any harm to the substance, be regarded as metaphor. And I think it's really important to distinguish between those two categories. I'm not prepared to say, yes, Christianity makes lots of metaphorical claims, and it's fine to see them as merely metaphor. It follows from what we were saying before about the the different levels of reality which it seems exist in the universe. That there may be many senses in which certain propositions, even those sorts of propositions which we characterize as empirical, may be true. Even when asserting that X is true might appear to be completely contradicted by something else that we can empirically demonstrate as true. But it may be that in a different dimension, it's possible that both can coexist. And I think that one of the things that we mean when we talk about wisdom, as opposed to knowledge or data processing or any of the other things which are commonly mistaken for wisdom these days, is the ability to realize that black might be white while still remaining black. So that the reconciliation of opposites, and that might be another way of expressing that great Upper Paleolithic realization that a bone can remain a bone while still being a wolf.
Interesting. Yeah. So to Paleolithic people, of course, they couldn't have been Christian because there was no Jesus for another 38,000 years. Okay. So what happens to them when they die? I mean,
they were passionately religious.
Yeah.
If you see religion in the archaeological record, you've got behaviorally modern humans, and if you don't see it, you haven't, to a first degree of approximation.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So belief in God probably is one of the defining characteristics of behaviorally modern humans.
Well, but belief in another dimension, a belief that death isn't the end, a belief probably that when humans die, their agency doesn't decrease but increases. These are all fairly quintessential markers of early human modernity.
Yeah. I could go down the path of some of this with you, as I have with Deepak Chopra and other people I've had on the show. You know, panpsychism maybe. I had John Mackey on, the CEO of Whole Foods, and he's kind of a Western Buddhist type. And at the end, he told me, "Don't worry about dying. You're gonna be in this other place. It's gonna be great." I'm like, okay, I hope you're right. But then it's one thing to say that in kind of a generic way. You know, there's some sort of higher power, something like this. Okay. But the Christian God and the specifics of the religion, to me, that takes us into a different realm of, well, how do you know that's the right one? As you know, as you already said, Muslims would say, no, we don't accept that. And Jews would say, no, we don't accept that. Why not? If the arguments are so good, why hasn't there been a convergence like, well, that's the right one? You're an anthropologist from Mars studying earthly religions. You'd ask, well, of course, they all think they're right. That's how it works. And it depends entirely on where you happen to have been born and when you happen to have been born. But you're leaning in towards saying, yeah, but this is actually the correct one.
Well,
or is that a reductionistic way of phrasing?
There is an amazing amount of convergence amongst people who reflect seriously on these things. Much greater convergence than there is divergence. And
you mean amongst Western?
It follows from what I've told you about my beliefs that
yes, okay, yeah.
That there are some historical facts which seem to me to be illustrations of the general principles about the way the universe behaves, which are very, very beautifully and powerfully expressed in the Christian story. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't powerful expressions in other creeds. Of course not. But the one that the one in which I choose to live um, is the one which I find most sustaining. Um,
Well,
and we
here,
don't choose to live. And again, this is repeating myself. We choose to live in houses. We choose to live in communities. We don't choose to live in sets of propositions. So
that's
if
true.
you ask a Greek Orthodox why they're Greek Orthodox, they're not going to recite the Nicene Creed to you. They're just going to say, "That's where I live. Um, it's where I come from. It's what I am. It's a it's a constituent of self in very much the way that the bones and ligaments are constituents. And the business of living inside that community, which includes but doesn't merely entail adherence to a certain set of propositions, is about the whole business of human living. It's about how you eat. It's about how you look at sunsets. It's about how you read poetry. It's about how you make love to your wife. All these things. I mean, you can't simply look at a catechism and say, right, that's the faith.
Right,
If that's the
right.
faith, then you have something so arid that it wouldn't attract anybody other than the desperate and the terminally lonely. It may be that some of the intellectual aridity of modern conservative evangelical Protestantism is an example of what I'm talking about. I don't want to denigrate other people, but if it is right that you are conservative evangelical Christians simply by uh, reciting your creed, then you have lost the plot or not got the plot. Um,
So would you then sign off on something like William James's pragmatism when it comes to religion as a package? That it's that kind of truth, a pragmatic truth?
it's that's it's more congenial to me than uh, evangelical Protestantism, but it's still an oversimplification. I mean, I want to say that religion, properly viewed, is a whole way of being in the universe, the whole way of relating to everything else in the universe, including its non-humans and including its water molecules. And uh, it it would be blasphemous presumption as well as intellectual naivety to think that there were there was any form of words in which that breadth of relationship could begin to be described. How how can you how can you describe, let alone begin to give a Euclidean or empirical proof for the existence of anything which is really worthwhile or sustaining? You know, I can't prove that I love my children. I can't prove the uh, likelihood of the goodwill of my best friends persisting. I can't prove that the moon that I'm looking at through the window now is a beautiful thing. I can't prove that Shakespeare is greater than Taylor Swift, etc., etc.
I think I could prove that one.
So almost okay. You're right. That was a bad example.
So, okay, I see. I think I understand. Maybe part of the problem is I'm asking these questions in this kind of scientism, reductionistic, enlightenment way of thinking about religion, and that's the wrong way to think about it. Maybe that's the point of your book.
Look, well, that is a lot of the point of my book. So the immersive method which I use to seek to inhabit these three ages, Upper Paleolithic, Neolithic, Enlightenment, was an acknowledgement of the fact that we are embodied animals, and we get our ideas secondarily, parasitically, to the sensations which we have. So we can't reconstruct the history of ideas by reading books, or listening even to podcasts. We've got to feel the things which were going on in the balls and the brains and the guts when those thoughts were being generated, and quite a lot is lost in the translation from balls and gut and subconscious onto page and podcast. That's an artifact of the hold that language has over our cognition.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. Well, Charles, we're coming up on 2 hours here, so I just want to thank you for your time. That's this took a turn in a direction I hadn't anticipated, but in a good way. I think we've pretty much hit most of the major controversies and ideas in Western thought, and maybe even Eastern thought, I guess, of any thought. So, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Just curious,
well,
where would you point? Where would you point
Sorry.
people to sources that they could look up? Just kind of where you wrapped up there, like these are the best argument, not the best arguments for Christianity, but kind of the best understanding of religiosity in general.
Well, best understanding of religiosity in general, you really can't improve on William James, I don't think. That's a good place to start.
I agree. All right. Well, maybe that's your next book, putting it all together after you write the Axial Age book. All right, Charles. Thank you so much for your time.
Michael, great to speak to you.